A man walks across open ground in Central Europe. There is no wall in front of him. No mountain blocks his path. No desert. No great river he cannot cross. The sea is far behind him, and the high country is days away to the south. Between them, for hundreds of kilometers, the land simply opens. This is the Polish Gate. The name is misleading. There is no gate. There are no towers. There are no guards. There is no fortified line drawn on the earth. There is only a corridor of land, low, wide, walkable, running between the Baltic Sea in the north and the Carpathian Mountains in the south. Whoever lives in this corridor inherits a problem that no amount of courage can solve. The land is open in every direction that matters. That is the first fact of Polish history. Before there was a Poland, before there was a king, before there was a Christian altar or a written law, there was a piece of geography that could not defend itself. The same flatness that allowed grain to be grown and rivers to be navigated also allowed armies to march. Trade and invasion used the same roads. A merchant and a war band moved through the same passes. A people who wanted to survive in this corridor needed more than villages. They needed to organize food, timber, weapons, men, at a scale that scattered farmers could not produce on their own. Poland did not begin with a crown. It began with a problem. The land gave a great deal. Forests for timber, rivers for fish, soil for grain once the trees were cleared, iron in the ground in the south, honey and wax from the woods, amber on the Baltic shore, furs from the deep forest, salt from the springs near Wieliczka, pitch and tar from the pines. The corridor was rich for those who knew how to work it. But the land also demanded structure. It demanded grain stored in one place, rather than scattered across 100 huts. It demanded men armed by one ruler, rather than each clan defending its own fence. It demanded walls raised by organized labor, rather than by neighbors, patching what they could. And it demanded a political imagination large enough to understand that survival depended on being recognized by neighbors, by churches, by empires, before being consumed. This is the story of how that recognition was won. It is not a clean story. There is no founding father stepping ashore with a banner. There is no original document signed in a hall by men in robes. There are pots in the ground, charred timber, iron slag. Silver coins struck 1,000 miles away, in cities the local people had never heard of. Captives moving south in chains. Ramparts built from oak and packed earth. There is a dynasty that learned to extract grain from peasants and silver from trade. There is a ruler who chose his religion the way a general chooses ground, for the strategic position it gave him. And there is a wind that never stops crossing the plain. To understand any of this, we have to begin further back than the Slavs, further back than the chronicles, further back than the names that survive on any map. We have to begin with the land itself and with what the people who lived on it before us left behind. The first witnesses do not speak. No chronicler from the Bronze Age tells us who the people of the Vistula thought they were. No priest writes down the gods. No farmer describes the harvest. No warrior names the enemy outside the palisade. For most of the period this story covers, there is no writing at all in these lands. There is only what people left behind in the soil: pots, graves, burnt timber, iron slag, animal bones, weapon fragments, post holes where wooden uprights once stood. Ash, the dark stains where houses once stood, the long lines where walls once ran. This silence is dangerous because for a long time modern politics tried to make it speak. A burial rite was turned into a people. A type of pot was turned into a tribe. A fortified settlement was turned into proof that one nation or another had owned the land first. 20th century governments, German, Soviet, Polish, pressured archaeologists to find ancestors in the soil. The dead were drafted into wars they could not refuse. Maps were drawn over their graves. The ground does not work that way. Archaeology gives evidence. It does not give confession. A weapon in a grave is not a passport. A pot is not a language. A culture identified by archaeologists is not a nation waiting for its flag. The honest historian has to read the soil for what it actually says and refuse to make it say more. Once that warning is in place, the evidence can be read. From roughly 1300 to 500 BCE, the lands that would later become Poland were dominated by what archaeologists call the Lusatian culture. The name comes from Lusatia, a region straddling what is now eastern Germany and western Poland, where the cultural type was first defined in the 19th century. Its people cremated their dead and buried the ashes in urns. They left vast cemeteries, some with hundreds, sometimes thousands of graves, communities that lived, farmed, fought, mourned, and vanished without writing a single line about themselves. Their most famous site is Biskupin. Biskupin sits on a wetland peninsula in the Pałuki region of central Poland, in the modern Kujawian-Pomeranian voivodeship. It is iconic for one reason: water preserved its timber. Most prehistoric sites give us only stone, bone, and ceramic. The wood is long gone, rotted, eaten, returned to soil. At Biskupin, the marsh kept the oak. When the site was excavated in the 1930s, archaeologists pulled timber from the ground that had been cut more than 2,500 years before. Tree ring dating later showed that many of the oaks used in the construction were felled in a tight window in the 8th century BCE. Some scholars place the main building phase around 738 BCE, give or take a few years. That precision is unusual for the prehistoric world. It lets us see one ancient moment of labour with something close to clarity. Trees cut in winter when the sap was low, logs dragged across frozen ground, beams shaped with bronze and early iron tools, walls raised in rows, houses crowded inside the perimeter, over 100 of them, packed close, each one sharing walls with its neighbour, streets paved with timber, a breakwater on the lakeside to keep the water from eating the foundation. Biskupin was not Poland. It was not a Polish fortress, and it was not a medieval stronghold before its time. The people who built it spoke no language we can identify with certainty. They left no descendants we can trace through pure cultural inheritance. Their world ended. The settlement burned, was rebuilt, was abandoned, was overgrown. But it tells us something older and more useful than nationhood. People living in this corridor understood defence long before there was a Polish state. They built in timber because timber was what the land gave them. They crowded their houses behind walls because the wall answered a real fear. A palisade is never only architecture. It is a sign that danger exists outside. Centuries later, during the Roman period, another culture spread across central and southern Poland. The Przeworsk, named for a town in the southeast, where its characteristic cemeteries were first identified. These people lived beyond Rome's frontier. They did not live beyond Rome's reach. The empire pulled at distant societies through trade, prestige, coin, glass, weapons, and desire. Amber moved south from the Baltic. The famous Amber Road, running from the coast through the Polish lowlands, across the Carpathians, down to the Adriatic and the markets of Aquileia. Roman goods moved north. Glass beads, bronze vessels, coins, belt fittings, weapons. Along the routes between the Danube and the sea, objects travelled further than armies. The Przeworsk world was a world of iron. In the Świętokrzyski region, the Holy Cross Mountains of southern Poland, ancient ironworking reached a remarkable scale. The numbers are still being refined as new sites are mapped, but the order of magnitude is clear. Tens of thousands of bloomery furnaces have been documented across that landscape, perhaps more. Each furnace was a clay-built structure where iron ore was smelted with charcoal at high temperature. The slag, the waste material from the smelting process, sits in the soil in such quantities that whole valleys still show the chemical signature of the ancient industry. This was not a craft, it was an industry. Iron meant tools, iron meant weapons. Iron meant the ability to clear more forest, farm more land, and strike harder at any enemy who came across the open ground. A community with iron could defend itself. A community without iron could not. Some scholars believe that a portion of this iron production may have been linked, directly or indirectly, to demand from across the Roman frontier, that the empire's hunger for metal pulled even barbarian economies into its orbit. Further north, near the lower Vistula and the Baltic, archaeologists identify the Wielbark culture, often associated with Goths and other Germanic-speaking groups. Its cemeteries and stone circles have attracted generations of attention. The stone circles in particular, at Odry, at Wensiori, at other sites, have a strange, deliberate quality that has drawn scholars and amateur theorists alike. Some of that attention has been careful, some of it has not. In the early 20th century, German nationalist scholarship used Wielbark sites to argue for ancient Germanic ownership of these lands, an argument that fed directly into Nazi territorial claims. After the war, Polish nationalist scholarship sometimes responded by minimizing the Germanic connection. The truth lies in the evidence, which is mixed, complex, and resistant to simple identity claims. Ancient movement has often been turned into modern claim, as if the dead existed to settle later arguments about borders. Then, in the 4th and 5th centuries, the connections weaken. The Roman world was shaken by pressure from the steppe. The Huns moved west. Gothic groups were displaced and displaced others in turn. Trade thinned. Some communities moved. Some settlements contracted. Some identities changed. In parts of the Vistula and Oder lands, the archaeological record becomes poorer, thinner, and harder to read. The land was not empty. That old idea is too simple. But something had changed. Long-distance networks loosened. Imported goods became rarer. Power that had depended on Roman exchange became harder to hold. Cultivated places may have slipped back towards scrub and forest. The dense networks of the Roman period gave way to something quieter, harder to see, harder to date. History does not always announce a turning point. Sometimes it leaves fewer objects. Into that thinner record came the Slavs. Their expansion across Europe was one of the great transformations of the early Middle Ages, and one of the easiest to misunderstand. They did not arrive as one army. They did not march under a single banner. They had no king at the head of a column. They were not yet nations in any modern sense. They were communities, kin groups, farming households, warriors, captives, traders, migrants, local leaders, speaking related dialects across a broad belt of Eastern and Central Europe. They moved at the speed of seasonal labour. They settled where the land allowed. They displaced some peoples, absorbed others, and were absorbed in turn by still others. Their expansion took generations, not campaigns. They entered written history late, because others wrote about them first. Byzantine generals encountered them as raiders along the Danube. The historian Procopius described them in the 6th century, writing from Constantinople. Maurice's Strategikon, a Byzantine military manual from around 600, gave detailed advice on how to fight them. Frankish chroniclers met them on the western frontier. Latin clerics met them as missionaries. The Slavs are described from outside, in languages they did not speak, by men who were trying to understand a problem. Where they came from is still debated. Some scholars place their original homeland in the Pripyat marshes, a vast wetland region on what is now the border between Belarus and Ukraine. Others look further east, towards the middle Dnieper and the forest steppe zone. Some recent genetic studies have complicated the picture rather than clarified it. The honest answer is not one dot on a map. It is a wider zone of related communities whose language and material culture expanded rapidly when the older political and economic structures around them collapsed. What moved was not only people, it was a way of living. Early Slavic communities built modest settlements. Many of their houses were partly sunken into the ground, pit houses, sometimes called Grubenhäuser in the German archaeological literature. The floor was dug down 1/2 meter or more. Walls of timber and wattle rose from the edge. The roof came down close to the ground. The form was practical. It held heat in winter. It used less timber. It could be built by a family in a few weeks. Their pottery was handmade, simple, often undecorated. The Prague-type pottery, named for the region where it was first identified, is the classic marker of early Slavic settlement across a wide belt of Central and Eastern Europe. Their agriculture relied on small fields, livestock, river fish, forest products, and seasonal labour. They left behind no stone palaces, no triumphal inscriptions, no monuments built to last beyond a generation. Their world was not primitive because it lacked grandeur. It was adapted to survival in difficult country, where mobility and modesty were assets rather than weaknesses. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Slavic-speaking groups had spread across enormous distances, south into the Balkans, where they would eventually become Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bulgarians, west towards the Elbe and the Saale, north towards the Baltic, across the upper Vistula and the Oder. The expansion was so fast and so wide that historians still argue about its mechanisms. How much was migration? How much was the spread of a way of life adopted by existing populations? How much was elite-driven? How much was ordinary households moving where the land allowed? The Byzantine military writers noticed them because they were hard to fight. The Slavs avoided open battle. That mattered. Imperial armies were built around discipline, formation, and heavy cavalry. Strengths that worked in open country against an enemy willing to stand and fight. The Slavs would not stand. They used woods, rivers, marshes, ambush, dispersal, local knowledge. They vanished into reeds and trees. They struck from cover and disappeared. They drowned cavalry in marshes. They cut supply lines and left the main force untouched. The Strategikon devotes a long passage to fighting them, and the tone is wary. It warns that the Slavs are good at hiding in the brush, at swimming underwater with reeds for breathing tubes, at using rough terrain. A Roman or Byzantine officer could win a pitched battle and still lose a campaign, because the enemy never offered the kind of fight he was trained to win. The terrain between the Oder and the Vistula rewarded exactly that style of war. It rewarded people who understood concealment and endurance. Forest, marsh, river crossing, hidden path. The early Slavs who settled into this corridor did not inherit a ready-made country. They inherited space, forest, old clearings, river routes, abandoned places, contested land, and the ruins of earlier worlds whose names were already fading. What they did with that inheritance is what made everything that followed possible. By the 9th century, written sources begin to give us names. No one looking across this region in 850 or 900 would have seen Poland. They would have seen river peoples, coastal traders, sacred hills, fortified centres, forest settlements, and rival elites testing how far their power could reach before another group stopped it. The names we use for these groups come from later evidence, from outside observers, from medieval lists, from memory. The most famous of those lists is the so-called Bavarian Geographer, a Latin document from the mid-9th century, probably compiled at a monastery in the eastern Frankish realm, that names the peoples east of the empire and counts the strongholds each group held. It is a strange document. The numbers are sometimes implausible. The names are not always identifiable. But it is one of the earliest written windows into the Slavic world we are about to enter. The names are useful. They are not a clean political map. In the south, along the upper Vistula, were the Wishlani, the Vistulans, the people of the river. Their centre lay around Krakow and Wawel Hill, a limestone height with obvious strategic value. The hill rises sharply above the surrounding plain, with the river as a natural moat on one side. Wherever you put a fortification on Wawel, you could see what was coming. The Wishlani were closer than most northern groups to the Christian powers of Moravia and Bohemia. That contact brought opportunity and danger in equal measure. There is a much-discussed passage in the life of St. Methodius, the 9th century missionary, who, with his brother Cyril, brought Slavic language Christianity to the Moravians. The text refers to a powerful pagan prince in the Vistula lands who was warned to accept baptism voluntarily, and who, the text says, was eventually compelled to receive it as a captive. The story is brief. The exact identity of this Vistulan prince is uncertain. But it is one of the first moments where a ruler in this corridor steps, however briefly, into the written record of his enemies. A pagan ruler on the upper Vistula could trade with Christian neighbours. He could fight them. He could marry into their world, or he could be forced into it. To the west, in Silesia, were the Schlengani, named for Mount Schlenger. The mountain is not high by alpine standards, about 718 metres, but it rises with force out of the surrounding lowland. Sacred places do not need to be enormous. They need to dominate the country around them. Schlenger did. Long before Christian churches controlled the landscape, that mountain carried ritual meaning. Stone sculptures of unclear date, figures of bears, monks, fish, sit on its slopes and at its summit. Some may be pre-Christian, some may be later. The dating is contested. What is not contested is that the mountain was a place people went to for reasons that were not only practical. To the north, the Pomeranian coast followed a different rhythm. The sea changed everything. Salt, fish, amber, boats, river mouths, and maritime trade tied coastal communities into the wider Baltic world. Wollin, on an island at the mouth of the Oder, became one of the great trading centres of the region. It is mentioned by the 11th century chronicler Adam of Bremen as Jumne, a place of remarkable wealth and ethnic mixture. Slavic, Scandinavian, Saxon, and other merchants could meet there. Norse sagas refer to the city, sometimes mythologized, as Jomsborg, the supposed home of the Jomsvikings, a warrior brotherhood whose historical reality is debated and whose legendary status is not. Silver entered these economies, so did slaves. The Baltic was not only a sea of traders and raiders, it was part of a commercial system in which human beings could be captured, moved, priced, and sold. Hold that point. We will come back to it, because it matters more than the textbooks usually admit. Further east in Mazovia, settlement faced the forest and the sandy interior. Survival depended on woodland knowledge, hunting, gathering, fishing, beekeeping, moving through country where settlements were scattered and roads were rare. Honey mattered, wax mattered. Forest products were not marginal, they were wealth. Beeswax in particular was a major early medieval commodity. Churches across Europe needed candles, candles needed wax. The forests of Mazovia and the lands further east supplied that demand for centuries. It is easy to forget that one of the things holding the Christian liturgy together, the burning candle on the altar, depended on a peasant climbing a tree in a forest 1,000 kilometers away to cut a comb out of a hollow trunk. And in the central west, between the Warta and Notech rivers, in a region of lakes and fields and defensible ground, were the Polani. Their name is usually understood as people of the fields or people of the open land. That matters. It ties them not to a mountain or a sea or a sacred grove, but to cleared land, to settlement, to cultivation, to the kind of open country from which surplus could be taken, from which grain could be demanded, from which labor could be extracted, from which armies could be fed. The Polani were not obviously destined to rule the others. They were not the oldest name in any source. They were not the most famous. They were not the most strategically positioned by sea or by mountain. States almost always look inevitable after they succeed. They rarely look inevitable before. If you had asked a 10th century traveller which of these groups would give its name to a kingdom that lasted 1,000 years, the Wishlani around Krakow might have been a more obvious answer. They were closer to Christianity, closer to wealth, closer to the major Christian neighbours. The Polani advantage was practical, not romantic. Their heartland was compact. Its rivers, lakes, forests and fields could be organised. Its settlements could be linked. Its food surplus could be seized. Its strongholds could support each other within a day's march. A force based at Gniezno could reach Poznan or Giech inside a long day's ride. That distance, close enough for mutual support, far enough to hold separate territory, is the kind of thing that does not look important on a map and turns out to decide everything. In the 10th century, a dynasty emerged among the Polani, whose success would erase most of the alternatives. We call them the Piasts. Before they rose, the older Slavic world has to be seen on its own terms, because what the Piasts did was not invent that world. It was conquer it. It was not a world without order. It had households, kin groups, territorial communities, customs, assemblies, leaders, priests or ritual specialists, warriors, slaves, dependents, and the dead. But power was local. The basic unit was not yet a state with written administration. It was the community of settlement and land, often described through the Slavic term opolo. An opole was a local territorial community, a cluster of settlements bound by shared fields, pastures, obligations, defence, and dispute settlement. The exact meaning of the word and how widely it applied across Slavic lands has been debated. But the broad idea is recognizable. It was the world of neighbours, kin, harvests, boundaries, and collective responsibility before princely authority reached deeply into ordinary life. If a wolf took a calf, the opole knew. If a stranger came down the road, the opole knew. If a man killed another, the opole gathered and decided what was owed. When common decisions had to be made, free men gathered in a week, a local assembly. This was not democracy in the modern sense. It was a gathering of those with standing in the community, where consent, pressure, custom, rank, and persuasion all mattered. Women were not formally part of it. Slaves were not formally part of it. Young men without their own household were not formally part of it. But within those limits, decisions were made through a process that could not simply be commanded from above. A leader could not simply command the way a later king could. His authority depended on success, generosity, force, ritual standing, and his ability to reward followers with grain, weapons, and silver. A leader who lost battles, lost followers. A leader who hoarded wealth instead of distributing it, lost followers. A leader who could not bind his men to him through gifts and food and shared danger, lost his men. And once his men were gone, he was nothing. Religion ran through this world, but the evidence for early Slavic belief is broken and difficult. No pagan scripture survives because the Slavs did not write one. There is no Slavic Edda, there is no Slavic Iliad. What we have comes from Christian chroniclers writing from outside, often hostile, from later church prohibitions that name the practices priests were trying to stamp out, from archaeology, wooden idols pulled from rivers and bogs, ritual deposits, burial customs, from folklore that survived into the modern era and was recorded in the 19th and 20th centuries by ethnographers. From comparative mythology, which tries to reconstruct the older system by looking at what is shared across Slavic peoples, from place names, from traditions that centuries of Christianity had already transformed before anyone wrote them down. Any reconstruction has to be careful. Still, some shapes can be seen. Perun appears across Slavic tradition as a god of thunder, storm, oak, sky, weapons, and warrior force. His name is cognate with the Baltic god Perkunus, and behind both, scholars trace an Indo-European pattern of sky thunder deities that runs back thousands of years. Veles, in later reconstruction, is connected with cattle, wealth, magic, water, and the underworld, sometimes set against Perun in a cosmic opposition that some scholars see as fundamental to the older Slavic cosmology. Whether every Slavic community in the 7th century held these beliefs in the same way cannot be proven. But the broader pattern is clear. The world was not divided neatly between ordinary matter and invisible power. The household, the forest, the river, the grave, the field, the animal, the storm, the ancestor, all of these carried danger and obligation. The line between living and dead was thinner than it later became. The line between human and spirit was thinner. The line between the body and the soul was a place where ritual had work to do. The household had its guardians. The forest had its masters and its terrors. The river could feed and could take. The field could turn hostile in heat or hunger. The dead remained close. Ancestors were not simply gone. They required memory, caution, and sometimes feeding, small offerings of food and drink, especially at certain points in the year. Burial customs varied across time and region, but cremation was widespread among early Slavic communities. Fire transformed the body. Ashes were placed in vessels. Grave goods were chosen, sometimes weapons, sometimes tools, sometimes ornaments, sometimes food. Ritual acts connected the living to those who had passed beyond ordinary sight. Later, folk traditions preserved figures we still half recognize. The domoic, the spirit of the household, behind the stove. He had to be respected. Food was sometimes left out for him. A new bride entering the house had to be introduced to him properly, or she would have no peace. The lessee, the master of the forest, somewhere beyond the tree line. He could lead a man in circles for hours. He could change his size at will, taller than the trees one moment, smaller than a fox the next. A traveller who entered his forest without the right gestures was not guaranteed to come out. The Rusauki, near water. The spirits of girls who had drowned or who had died unmarried. They were beautiful and dangerous. They could pull a young man into the water if he was not careful. There was a week in early summer, Rusalka week, when it was unsafe to swim alone. The Pawudnika, the noon witch of the harvest field, who would strike a worker too long under the summer sun. The figure is partly a folk explanation for sunstroke. It is also more than that. She had a sickle. She asked questions. The wrong answer meant death. These figures cannot be pushed back unchanged into the 6th or 7th century. They were collected by ethnographers in the 19th and 20th centuries, in villages where folk belief had been overlaid with centuries of Christianity. But they show something durable about the older world. Sacred force lived where daily life happened. Behind the stove, at the tree line, beside the river, in the field at noon, at the grave. The calendar followed labour and fear. Winter demanded fire and stored food. Spring demanded cleansing, the burning of effigies, the symbolic drowning of winter. Midsummer gathered fertility, courtship, water, and flame. Boys and girls leapt over fires. Wreaths were thrown into rivers. Couples vanished into the woods together. Kupala night, which Christianity later renamed and tried, with mixed success, to discipline. Harvest required endurance. The dead required attention, especially in autumn. Ritual was not decoration. It was one way communities negotiated with what they could not control. That older world did not disappear in one baptism. It would be pressed, renamed, condemned, absorbed, and slowly transformed across centuries. Christian priests would build churches, discipline calendars, condemn old rites, and teach new names for old powers. Saint Elijah took on some of Perun's thunder. The Virgin Mary took on some of the older female powers tied to fertility and protection. St. George took on some of the cattle guardian functions of older male figures. The names changed. The functions, in many cases, did not. Beneath the first Christian order, older habits remained. In the household, the field, the graveyard, the forest edge, and the stories told after dark. The Piasts rose inside that world, not outside it. They did not abolish it. They organized it. They taxed it. They armed themselves from it. And eventually, they baptized it. Their achievement was not that they invented power. Their achievement was that they changed its scale. For centuries, Slavic power in this region had been local. A leader could dominate a valley, a river crossing, a sacred hill, a market, a cluster of fortified settlements. He could raid his neighbours. He could collect tribute from the villages within reach of his men. He could marry his daughters into other ruling families and call that a peace. But the structures were small, the surplus was limited, and the men who served him went home when the season turned. The Piasts built something larger and more frightening. They turned local lordship into a machine. The central instrument of that machine was the grod. In early medieval Slavic usage, a grod was a fortified settlement. The word survives, slightly transformed, in modern Polish grod, in Russian gorod, in the place name suffix you see across the Slavic world: Belgrade, Novgorod, Stargard, Białogard. Wherever you see that root, you are seeing a fortified centre. A grod was part fortress, part storehouse, part military base, part refuge, part centre of rule. It was not a castle in the later stone and tower sense. It was timber, earth, and labour. Massive ramparts packed from logs and packed soil, sometimes 10 or 15 metres thick at the base. A core of crossed timber beams, layers of earth and clay packed between them, a timber palisade on top, a ditch dug around the outside, often filled with water where the ground allowed, a single fortified gate, sometimes with a tower above it. In a world before stone castles, this was how power became visible. A grod did several things at once. It gathered food from the surrounding countryside: grain, livestock, hides, honey, wax, fish. It housed the ruler's men, sometimes a dozen, sometimes 100 or more. It controlled movement on the roads and rivers. It offered protection in war. The surrounding population could flee inside the walls when raiders came. And it reminded every farmer for kilometres around who could demand grain, labour, animals, and obedience. The scale of the Piast network was extraordinary. At Gniezno, at Poznań, at Giecz, at Grzybowo, at Ostrów Lednicki, at dozens of smaller centres, ramparts were raised from oak and earth in the second half of the 10th century. The dating is now extremely precise, thanks to dendrochronology. Tree ring dating applied to the timbers preserved in waterlogged ground. We can date specific construction phases at specific strongholds to within a year or two. The numbers are difficult to grasp. A single major stronghold could consume thousands of mature oaks. Trees had to be felled with axes. The trunks had to be transported, often across difficult ground. The beams had to be shaped. They had to be stacked into a grid pattern. The grid had to be packed with soil and clay. The whole structure had to be raised, sometimes 10 metres, sometimes more, and then capped with a palisade. Moats had to be dug, earth had to be moved, food had to be stored, animals had to be driven inside the walls when raids came. Watch had to be kept day and night, summer and winter, in heat and rain, and the cold that comes off a Polish lake in February. None of this happened through charm. A stronghold state requires coercion. Someone gave the order. Someone delivered the timber. Someone gave up grain. Someone fed the warriors who did not spend the season behind a plough. Someone lost when a rival centre was burned or absorbed. Behind every ring of timber walls, there was a population doing labour they had not freely chosen. Behind every garrison, there was a community paying tribute it had not freely offered. The grain in the stores came from peasants who could not refuse the demand. The men on the walls were fed by people who would not eat as well that winter. The Piasts also understood a military truth that every successful early ruler had to learn. Farmers could fight. Farmers could not campaign. A peasant levy could defend a village. It could repel a small raid. It could be marched to the local stronghold in time of war. But it could not march for weeks. It could not stay in the field through the harvest. It could not be trusted in a long siege. Its loyalty was local. Its equipment was limited. Its training was nothing. A ruler who wanted to expand needed armed men who depended on him directly. Men who ate from his stores. Men who slept under his roof. Men who fought his wars and had nothing to return to if he fell. Men who were, in a real sense, his, body and labour and loyalty. That was the function of the druzina. The druzina was the ruler's armed retinue. The word is related to drug, friend, companion. These were the prince's companions in arms, not a militia, not a levy of villagers carrying tools with blades, a professional or semi-professional warrior band, maintained by the ruler's resources, attached to his household, dependent on his success. In a world before standing national armies, the druzina was the sharp edge of princely power. These men were expensive. Chainmail, helmets, horses. A single war horse could cost the equivalent of a small farm. Swords, pattern-welded blades imported from the Frankish world were worth a fortune. Spears, shields, food, gifts, maintenance. The archaeological evidence from elite Piast graves shows weapons and armour of remarkable quality, including pieces that point to long-distance trade and to Scandinavian connections. Some of the men in the early Piast druzina may not have been local. Scandinavian material in elite graves, particular types of swords, axes, brooches, shows that the Piast world was not sealed from the north. Vikings moved through these lands by river. Some came as raiders, some came as traders, some stayed. A strong ruler did not ask too many questions about where every useful sword had first learned to kill. If a man could fight and would fight for him, that was enough. All of this demanded surplus. That surplus had to come from somewhere. Agriculture mattered. Tribute mattered. Trade mattered. So did violence. In the 10th century, silver moved through Eastern and Central Europe in enormous quantities. Islamic dirhams, silver coins minted far away in the Abbasid Caliphate and the Samanid Emirate of Central Asia, travelled north through trade networks linking the Islamic world, the Rus's river routes, the steppe, the Baltic, and Central Europe. The numbers are remarkable. Hundreds of thousands of these coins, perhaps more, ended up buried in hoards across the Slavic and Scandinavian worlds. They were cut into pieces. They were weighed on small scales. They were tested for silver content. They were remelted into ingots. They were buried in the ground when their owners feared raids, and very often never recovered, because the owner died and the location was lost. Silver entered the economies of rulers who needed to reward men, but the trade that carried silver was not innocent. Captives were among its commodities. Slavic lands were tied deeply to the slave trade of early medieval Europe. The English word slave itself comes from Slav, because so many people taken from these regions ended up sold in distant markets. Latin sclavus, the medieval term for an unfree person, took its name from the same root. The connection is not coincidental. It is etymology recording history. Captives taken in war could be moved through Prague, a major slave market, particularly active in the 10th century, through the Rus's routes down the great rivers towards the Black Sea, through Baltic trading centres, through Verdun in the western Frankish lands, where eunuchs were prepared for the Iberian and North African markets. The buyers were in the Islamic world, in Byzantium, in the Mediterranean. This was not an accidental shadow beside state formation. This was one of the ways war paid for itself. A successful raid produced silver indirectly, by producing captives who could be sold for silver. The silver paid the warriors raided again. The cycle did not need to be invented by anyone. It maintained itself as long as there were rivals to fight and markets to buy. The Piast realm was built from fields and forests, but also from bodies. Timber made the ramparts, grain fed the garrisons, silver held the warrior band together, and captives, people taken from rival communities and sold beyond the horizon, helped connect local violence to international exchange. A man taken outside Gniezno in 950 might end his life in Cordoba or Constantinople or Cairo. He would never come home. His name would not survive. He would appear in no chronicle. He would leave no archaeological trace except perhaps an unmarked grave thousands of kilometers from the river he was born beside. That is the harder story beneath the later legend. Medieval dynasties rarely preserved memories of conquest in their raw form. They preferred providence, they preferred virtue, rightful succession, and divine favor. They preferred a story in which they were chosen, not in which they had butchered their way to the top. The Piasts were no exception. The chronicler we know as Gallus Anonymus, writing in Latin in the early 12th century, about 150 years after the events he describes, gave the dynasty an origin story that replaced violence with moral clarity. We do not know who Gallus was. The name is later. He may have been a Frenchman. He may have been a Venetian. He may have been an Italian Benedictine connected with the Hungarian court. He wrote his chronicle in Poland, probably under the patronage of a Piast ruler, and he wrote it for a Piast audience. That matters when reading what he says. Before the Piasts, he wrote, there was Popiel, a cruel ruler associated with Lake Gopwo in the Kuyavia region. Popiel was treacherous. He was dominated, in the tale, by a foreign wife. He murdered his own kin to consolidate power, invited his uncles to a feast and poisoned them. And his crime produced a grotesque punishment. From the bodies of the murdered men came mice. Popiel fled to a tower on the lake. The mice followed him. They crossed the water. They climbed the walls. They devoured him and his entire family. In Popiel's place rose Piast, a humble wheelwright. Where Popiel had hoarded power and corrupted it, Piast showed hospitality. At the first haircut ceremony of his son, a major rite of passage in Slavic culture, when a small boy's hair was cut for the first time and he passed into the world of older children, two mysterious visitors arrived at his door. Popiel had rejected them. Piast welcomed them in. He shared what little he had. The food and drink in the house multiplied as they ate. The strangers blessed the boy, Siemowit, and through him the future dynasty received the shape of providence. It is a brilliant political story. It says tyranny destroys itself. Hospitality is rewarded. The old ruler falls because he is morally rotten. The new dynasty rises because it is humble, generous, and chosen by powers beyond the human. Every element does work. The foreign wife of Popiel signals the danger of foreign influence, useful in a world where the Piasts had to navigate constant German pressure. The kin murder marks the old regime as cursed. The mice, multiplying from rotting bodies, turn the old order's crimes into the agents of its destruction. Piast's poverty makes the new dynasty look chosen rather than predatory. The mysterious visitors, sometimes interpreted as pagan in origin, perhaps Christian saints in the chronicler's later reading, give the dynasty cosmic backing. The hair-cutting ceremony grounds the story in real Slavic ritual that the audience would recognize. The archaeology suggests something else. Around Lake Gopwo and other centers in Kuyavia, rival powers existed before the Piasts rose. There are signs of strongholds destroyed in the 10th century, burned, abandoned, or absorbed. The expansion of the Piast core territory in this period almost certainly meant exactly what such expansions usually meant. Strongholds burned, leaders killed, populations brought under new tribute. Local elites either co-opted into the Piast system or eliminated from it. The legend of the mice does not have to be dismissed as meaningless. It should be read as memory turned into legitimacy. Something happened in the Kuyavian region that ended one set of powers and raised another. Whatever the truth was, it was uncomfortable enough that the dynasty preferred to remember it as divine punishment falling on a guilty tyrant. A dynasty that had won by force did not need to say so once it controlled the story. Before Mieszko I appears clearly in the written record, three shadowy ancestors stand between legend and history. Siemowit, Lestek, Siemomisu. We cannot reconstruct their lives in detail. The chronicles give us names and a few episodes. The archaeology gives us strongholds rising in the 9th and early 10th centuries. The two pieces of evidence do not match neatly enough to give us biography. But the state that Mieszko inherited around 960 was too organized, too well-funded, and too militarily capable to have been built in a single reign. Someone before Mieszko had already expanded the core territory. Someone had already organized the strongholds. Someone had already built the network of roads and outposts that allowed forces to move quickly between the major centers. Someone had already learned how to feed armed men through winter. Someone had already turned the Polani from one regional group among many into the center of a new and aggressive power. Someone had already broken or co-opted the rival groups to the east, the south, and the west, so that by the time Mieszko emerges into the written record, his realm extends far beyond the Polani heartland. Mieszko did not begin with emptiness. He inherited a weapon. What he had to decide was where to point it. The problem was that the weapon sat beside Christian empire. By the middle of the 10th century, the world west of the Oder was dangerous for any pagan ruler. The Saxon and German frontier had become a zone of tribute, war, missionary pressure, and expansion. The Ottonian rulers of East Francia, soon to be the Holy Roman Empire under Otto I, crowned in 962, pushed influence eastward through margraves, bishops' alliances, military campaigns, and Christian ideology. Pagan Slavs beyond the frontier could be treated as enemies, as tribute payers, as converts, as targets, often as several of those at once, depending on the season. Mieszko had to solve a strategic problem with religious consequences. If he remained pagan, his enemies could present war against him as Christian expansion, a holy duty rather than a land grab. The same justification was being used against the pagan Slavs of the Polabian region, west of the Oder, where Saxon margraves were already pushing into Slavic territory under the language of mission. The pattern was visible. Anyone watching could see what was coming. If he accepted baptism under direct German control, he risked something different, making his young state spiritually and politically dependent on the very power he most needed to resist. A church run by German bishops, appointed by German emperors, taking direction from a German ecclesiastical hierarchy, would not be his church. It would be theirs. The question was not whether Christianity mattered. Christianity was going to come. The question was who would control the terms of his entry into it. Mieszko's answer was Bohemia. To the south, the Przemyslid ruler Boleslav I governed a Slavic Christian polity already inside the Latin world. Bohemia had been Christian, in its rulers, for several decades. Its church was tied to the wider Latin order. Its liturgy was Latin. Its bishops took direction ultimately from Rome, not Magdeburg. Crucially, Bohemia was Slavic, culturally and linguistically closer to the Polani than the Saxon frontier was, and politically positioned as a buffer between the Empire and the Polish lands. Bohemia offered Mieszko a route into Christianity that did not require surrendering his church directly to the German frontier bishops. In 965, Mieszko married Dobrawa, Boleslav's Christian daughter. The marriage was not romantic decoration. It was diplomacy in its most serious form. A woman moved north, and with her came priests, rites, objects, language, and political connection. Dobrawa is an underrated figure in this story. The chronicles, written by men, give her a small role. Wife, conduit, source of pressure on her husband. The actual political weight she carried was probably much greater. A foreign princess at a pagan court, surrounded by her own clergy, conducting her own rites, demonstrating Christian practice to her husband's household. This is not a passive role. This is influence applied steadily, every day, inside the most powerful house in the kingdom. The following year, in 966, Mieszko accepted baptism. The scene is easy to over-imagine, and therefore dangerous. We do not know exactly where the baptism took place. Tradition associates it with several possible sites: Gniezno, Poznań, Ostrów Ledniki, even Regensburg. We do not know every detail of the ceremony. We do not know who held the cloth as he came up from the water. We do not know what Mieszko felt when the water touched him. History does not give us his inner life. What we can say is enough. A pagan ruler of a strong but vulnerable realm entered Latin Christianity. His decision altered the diplomatic status of his dynasty overnight. It created the basis for church organization inside his territory. It opened the door to Latin literacy, written administration, clerical networks, new law, new ritual, and new legitimacy. And it took away the weapon his enemies had been planning to use against him. After 966, no German bishop and no imperial chronicler could honestly call Mieszko a pagan target. That alone justified the decision. Even if nothing else had changed, the old gods did not vanish from the villages because a ruler entered the font. Conversion from above is not the same as conversion of an entire people. The first baptisms touched the elite, the ruler's household, the warrior band, and the centers of power. Rural belief moved more slowly. Sacred groves, household rites, seasonal customs, fear of the dead, charms, offerings, and local spirits did not disappear on command. In some places they did not disappear at all. They were renamed. They went underground. They wore Christian names and kept older meanings. The Południca did not vanish from the harvest field because there was a church in Gniezno. She is still in some Polish folk traditions today. But the direction of the state had changed. In 968, a bishopric was established at Poznań. Its exact early status and its relationship to wider church structures have been debated for centuries. It may have been directly subject to Rome. It may have been linked to Magdeburg in some less formal way. The records are too thin to settle the question, but the political meaning is clear. Mieszko wanted a Christian order that strengthened his rule without handing his state to German ecclesiastical control. The first bishop, Jordan, may have been brought in from outside, possibly from Liège, possibly from Italy. He was not a German appointee. The church became part of state formation. Stone churches began to appear in a world of timber. Latin writing entered a landscape that had been governed by memory, witness, and the spoken word. Chronicles became possible. Charters became possible. Boundaries could be described in writing rather than walked at the head of a procession of elders. Land could be granted to the church and held forever. in a way that had not been possible under purely customary Slavic property arrangements. Christianity did not soften Piast power. It gave it new instruments. Mieszko continued to fight. He expanded. He negotiated. He submitted to the empire when it was useful, paying tribute for some of his territories west of the Oder, attending imperial assemblies as a vassal when the diplomatic arithmetic required it. He resisted when it was necessary. He fought for influence in Pomerania and along the Oder. He fought against and alongside Bohemia, depending on the year. He played the Empire and Bohemia against each other when he could. He positioned himself among stronger neighbours without being swallowed by any of them. In 972, his forces won a sharp victory over a Saxon margrave named Hodo at the Battle of Sidinia, near the Oder. The detail is small. The signal is large. A Slavic Christian ruler had just defeated an imperial commander in the field. The frontier was no longer one way. One of the most important outside witnesses to his realm was Ibrahim ibn Yaqub. Ibrahim was a Jewish traveller from Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, who journeyed across Central Europe in the second half of the 10th century, possibly on a diplomatic mission. His original account is lost. What survives comes through later Arabic geographers, particularly al-Bakri in the 11th century, who quoted from him. The transmission is mediated. The details have to be handled with care. But the existence of the testimony itself matters. Ibrahim describes Mieszko as a significant ruler. He gives an estimate of Mieszko's military strength, a figure of 3,000 armoured warriors supported by a wider force that has been debated by historians ever since. Whether the number is exact, exaggerated, or rounded, it places Mieszko's power on the same scale as the major Christian rulers of his time. Ibrahim describes a system of taxation. He describes the ruler's wealth in kind. He describes a polity that functions, that has fixed centres, that can be navigated by a foreign visitor and reported on in writing. By Mieszko's reign, the Piast ruler was no longer invisible to the wider world. A traveller from Muslim Spain had heard of him, asked about him, and written him down in Arabic. That is what state formation does. It makes power legible to enemies, to merchants, to clerics, to distant observers who have never seen the ground. Near the end of his life, Mieszko produced one final document that gives us a glimpse of his political intelligence. It survives only as a corrupted summary in a later papal register, copied and recopied in the 11th century. Its opening words, Dagome Iudex, have caused long debate. Even the name appears distorted. The phrase is Latin. Dagome may be a mangled form of Dagobert, a baptismal name Mieszko may have taken, or it may be a corruption of his Slavic name itself. Iudex means judge or ruler. The original is lost. What we have is a summary copied into a papal collection, which is why historians treat the document carefully. Even in its damaged form, it matters. It appears to place Mieszko's realm, described in Latin with rough geographical limits, under the protection of St. Peter. That is, under the papacy. The exact intent is uncertain. It may have been tied to succession politics, especially to the position of Mieszko's second wife Oder and her sons, against the inheritance claims of his eldest son, Bolesław. It may have been a play for papal protection against the empire. It may have been an attempt to define his borders before Rome in a way that limited outside interference. We cannot recover Mieszko's full intention. But the larger meaning is clear. A ruler who had begun his reign as a pagan prince in a timber stronghold ended it by registering his realm with Rome. He understood that a young state needed more than warriors, needed recognition. It needed borders other powers could be made to describe. It needed protection, institutional, legal, spiritual, against neighbours who might claim authority in the name of the same faith he had adopted. Mieszko died in 992. The transformation was irreversible. He had not created Poland from nothing. The land was older than him. The Slavs had been there for centuries before his reign. The strongholds had risen before his baptism. The violence that made Piast power possible had begun before his name entered the written record. But Mieszko gave that power a place inside the Christian political order of Europe. He inherited a pagan stronghold realm of timber, tribute, warriors, and contested frontiers. He left behind a Christian dynasty recognized by the powers around it, attached to Rome, defended by armed retainers, and rooted in the great fortified centers of Greater Poland. The old world remained beneath the new one. In the villages, people still feared the forest at night. They still watched the rivers. They still remembered the dead. They still worked fields first cleared by axe and fire. They still lived with winter, hunger, obligation, and the demands of men who ruled from timber walls. Christianity had changed the language of power. It had not erased the ground on which power stood. The Polish gate remained open. That would never change. Armies would cross it, traders would use it, invaders would test it, kings would defend it. Empires, centuries later, would discover that this same geography could carry conquest in either direction. The plain that could not defend itself in the year 800 could not defend itself in 1939 either. Geography is patient. But after Mieszko, the corridor was no longer only a corridor. It had acquired a dynasty, it had acquired a church, it had acquired a name that outsiders would have to learn. Before Poland was Poland, there was land, forest, river, silver, captivity, timber, and fear. Then came the strongholds. Then came the ruler who understood that survival required more than courage. It required being recognized before being consumed. The wind still crossed the plain, but now it crossed a state in the making.